The maid interrupts her millionaire boss's engagement party and reveals that the groom is her. The clink of champagne glasses echoed through the marble hall of the Morrison mansion. The guests, members of the elite of Greenwich, Connecticut, moved in elegant waves through the space, their murmurs of approval mingling with the soft ambient music. In the kitchen, Isabella Rodriguez was cleaning a crystal goblet with automatic movements, her eyes fixed on the distorted reflection that the shiny surface provided. 17 years working in that house, and tonight would be her last. "Isabella, we need more canapes in the main room," Margaret, the head housekeeper, ordered, her voice tense with the pressure of the event. "For God's sake, try to smile. It's an engagement, not a funeral." If she only knew, thought Isabella, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged the savories on the silver tray. The weight of the envelope in her uniform pocket seemed to burn through the fabric. In the main room, Catherine Morrison, the sole heiress to the Morrison Technologies empire, glowed in her ivory Vera Wang dress, her red hair cascading over her shoulders in perfectly styled waves. Beside her, Mason Pierce, her fiancé, flashed that smile that had won not only Catherine's heart, but also the approval of the whole of Connecticut society. And when Mason asked me to marry him in our favorite restaurant in Manhattan, Catherine gestured animatedly to a group of guests, the engagement ring sparkling under the crystals of the chandelier. I just knew it was fate. Isabella watched the scene as the canapes were served, her eyes involuntarily fixed on Mason. The same shape of eyebrows, the same slightly pointed chin, the same way of tilting his head when he smiled. How had no one else noticed? Ladies and gentlemen, the voice of Richard Morrison, family patriarch and CEO of Morrison Technologies, filled the room. "If you could just give me your attention for a moment." The buzz gradually died down. Isabella felt her heart racing. It was now or never. Today is a special day, not just for our family, but for everyone who knows and loves Catherine and Mason, Richard continued, raising his glass. "When Mason walked into my office 3 months ago to ask for my daughter's hand in marriage, I didn't just get a son-in-law. I got the son I'd always wanted." Isabella felt the bitter taste of irony. With trembling fingers, she touched the envelope in her pocket, where the DNA test and old newspaper reports weighed like lead. "Mason represents everything we value," Richard continued. "Integrity, ambition, compassion. And lies?" Isabella's voice cut through the air like a razor. The silence that followed was deafening. All heads turned in a direction. Catherine frowned, confused. Mason, for his part, paled visibly, as if some part of him recognized something familiar in that determined voice. "Isabella," Margaret whispered warningly. "What are you doing?" Isabella stepped forward, her hands shaking as she pulled the envelope from her pocket. "I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison, but I can't allow this farce to continue. Mason Pierce is not who everyone thinks he is." "What are you talking about?" Catherine asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Mason Pierce was born Alexander Rodriguez," Isabella declared, her voice gaining strength. "He's my younger brother, kidnapped from St. Francis Hospital in Phoenix, Arizona, 28 years ago." The sound of a glass shattering against the marble floor echoed through the hall. Mason, or Alexander, had dropped his drink, his wide eyes fixed on Isabella. "This is absurd," Richard thundered, his face red with anger. "Security, I have all the evidence here." Isabella held up the envelope. The DNA test, the reports from the time, the half-moon-shaped birthmark he has on the back of his head, just like my brother. Mason instinctively put his hand to the back of his head, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Catherine, who was now watching him with a mixture of horror and incredulity. "Mason," she whispered, "is it true?" The silence that followed was her answer. Years of buried memories seemed to dance in Mason's eyes, fragments of the past he himself didn't fully understand beginning to make sense. I always knew I was adopted," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "But my parents, the Pierces, they said it was a legal adoption." "Your parents lied." Isabella took another step forward, tears now running freely down her face. "Our mother died 2 years ago, Mason. Her last request was that I never give up on finding you. And when I saw your picture in the paper announcing your engagement, I just knew." Chaos ensued in the hall. Guests whispered frantically, smartphones already capturing the moment that would surely make the headlines the next day. Catherine had pulled away from Mason, her hands covering her mouth in shock. Richard Morrison looked like he was about to explode. "This is ridiculous. You two don't even look alike," he protested. "Because I'm our mother's face," Isabella replied calmly, "and he's identical to our father." Mason staggered slightly, leaning on a nearby table. His certainties, his memories, his very identity. Everything was crumbling before his eyes. "Why now?" he asked, his voice only a whisper. "Why like this?" "Because you deserve to know the truth before you started a new life based on lies," Isabella replied. "And because I promised our mother that I would bring you home." The security guards finally arrived, positioning themselves next to Isabella. Richard Morrison gestured for them to remove her, but Mason held up his hand, stopping them. "Wait," he ordered, his eyes fixed on Isabella. "I want to see the evidence." With trembling hands, Isabella held out the envelope. The fate of two families, of two lives separated by decades of secrets, was about to be revealed in a DNA test and yellowed newspaper clippings. The engagement party of their dreams had turned into the beginning of a nightmare. Or perhaps, finally, the awakening of a long-buried truth. The envelope passed from hand to hand in the library of the Morrison mansion as if it were a bomb about to explode. The party had ended abruptly, leaving only the main people involved in the family drama that was unfolding. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, served by Margaret, who had refused to leave, her loyalties divided between the family she served and Isabella, whom she had known for so many years. Mason sat heavily in one of the leather armchairs, the documents spread out on the mahogany table in front of him. His hands trembled as he held up a sepia photograph, a smiling baby with a distinctive birthmark on the back of its head, exactly like his own. "That doesn't prove anything," Richard Morrison interjected, his voice tense. "A birthmark? Thousands of people could have something similar." "The DNA test proves it," Isabella replied calmly, still wearing her maid's uniform, now a strange suit of armor in that battle of truths. 99.9% genetic compatibility between siblings. The laboratory is one of the most respected in the country. Catherine stood by the window, her eyes fixed on the dark garden beyond the glass. Her engagement dress, once a symbol of happiness, now seemed to weigh a ton. "Why didn't the Pierces ever tell me?" Mason muttered, more to himself than to the others. "All these years, maybe because kidnapping is a serious crime," Isabella replied, her voice softening as she saw the pain in her brother's eyes. "The Pierce couple never had any other children, right? Did they move around constantly during their childhood?" Mason looked up, surprised. "Like you, typical behavior of people trying to escape the past," Isabella explained. "I followed up every lead on missing children who fit Alexander's description for years. When I saw his picture in the social paper, that smile, it's the same smile as our father's." Catherine finally turned, her red eyes meeting Mason's. "You always said you didn't have any photos of when you were a baby, that there was a fire." "That's what my parents, the Pierces, told me," Mason replied, his voice breaking. "Just like they said my original birth certificate was destroyed in the same fire." "Convenient," Richard commented dryly, pouring himself a whiskey. Isabella took another document out of the envelope. "This is the original missing persons report. St. Francis Hospital, Phoenix, Arizona. March 15th, 1996. A woman dressed as a nurse took Alexander Rodriguez for routine examinations and never returned." Mason closed his eyes, fragments of long-suppressed memories beginning to emerge. I have flashes sometimes. Dreams of a woman singing in Spanish. I always thought it was my imagination." "Our mother," Isabella whispered, tears escaping from her eyes. "Sising our niño every night." Catherine walked over to the table, picking up the DNA test. Her eyes scanned the numbers and graphs, looking for some flaw, some explanation that could restore her world to normal. "How did you get his DNA?" "The wine glass he used at Bellamy's restaurant 2 weeks ago," Isabella replied. "You always go there on Wednesdays." "I watched for weeks, waiting for the right opportunity." "You followed us?" Catherine asked, horrified. "I followed my brother." Isabella corrected gently. Catherine, I'm sorry it has to be this way, but you have to understand. Our mother died believing that her youngest son was still alive somewhere. Your last request. Stop. Mason stood up abruptly, knocking over some papers. I need to call the Pierces. Mason, wait. Richard tried to intercept him, but he already had his cell phone in his hand. The call went straight to voicemail. Just like the second and the third. They've disappeared, haven't they? Isabella asked softly. As soon as they saw the engagement announcement in the paper, they probably realized that it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Mason staggered, as if he'd been punched. Catherine instinctively moved to support him, but stopped halfway, the uncertainty in her eyes reflecting the chasm that was now opening up between them. Mr. Morrison, Margaret interrupted quietly from the doorway. The police are here. They like to talk to everyone. Richard straightened his tie, trying to keep his composure. Gut, let's clear up all this madness at once. There's nothing to clear up, Isabella declared, standing up. The truth is already here, in black and white. Mason, Alexander, is my brother, and he was stolen from our family 28 years ago. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. Mason looked at Catherine, then at Isabella, his fragmented identity reflected in the eyes of two women who represented completely different lives. I always knew, he whispered. Deep down, I always knew there was something wrong. The secrets, the constant changes, the lack of photos or documents. Isabella took a hesitant step towards him. Alexander, no. He held up his hand, stopping her from approaching. I'm still Mason. At least until I understand what all this means. The policeman entered the library, bringing with them the weight of the law and the promise that tonight was just the beginning of a journey that would change the lives of everyone present forever. The past, buried for so long, was finally coming to light, bringing with it truths that no one was truly prepared to face. The Greenwich Police Department was buzzing with activity, even at that late hour. In an interrogation room on the second floor, Detective Lauren Blackwell was arranging a series of photographs on the metal table, each one telling a fragment of the story unfolding before her. Mason, now also known as Alexander, looked at each image with a mixture of fascination and horror. The Pierces bought a house in Phoenix 3 months before their kidnapping, Lauren explained, pointing to an old photo of a modest home. Patricia Pierce worked as an administrative assistant at the same hospital where you were born. We got access to the old records. She had access to the maternity ward. So it wasn't a coincidence, Mason muttered, his voice hoarse after hours of testimony. His engagement suit, now creased, looked like it belonged to another life. The couple had a history of unsuccessful fertility treatments, Lauren continued, sliding another document across the table. 5 IVF attempts, 2 miscarriages. The last attempt was 3 months before her disappearance. On the other side of the mirrored glass, Isabella watched the interrogation alongside her lawyer, her hands clasping a rosary that had belonged to her mother. Catherine was sitting at the opposite end of the observation room, still in her wedding dress, looking like a bride abandoned at the altar. The records show that the Pierces moved 17 times in the first 10 years after the incident. Lauren flipped through some notes. Phoenix, Seattle, Portland, Denver, Chicago, always cities big enough to get lost in the crowd, never staying more than 2 years in the same place. Even Connecticut, Mason added, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. I was 12 when we settled here. They said they'd finally found the perfect place to raise a family. The statute of limitations for kidnapping doesn't expire, Lauren commented softly. They probably figured that after all this time, no one else would be looking. In the observation room, Catherine let out a muffled sob. Isabella fought the urge to go to her, to try to explain that she didn't want to hurt anyone either, just to put right an injustice that had destroyed her family. We got a warrant for the Pierce residence, Lauren continued. The house is empty. Neighbors say they left 2 weeks ago, right after the engagement was announced in the newspaper. They only took the essentials. Cowards, Mason muttered, silent tears streaming down his face. Not even an explanation. We found this in the attic. Lauren slid a yellowed envelope across the table. It was hidden behind a loose panel. With trembling hands, Mason opened the envelope. Inside, a series of newspaper clippings documented the disappearance of Alexander Rodriguez. There was also a small hospital identification bracelet and a tuft of dark hair attached to a cord with the date, March 15th, 1996. They kept everything. His voice faltered. On the other side of the glass, Isabella couldn't hold back a sob. Mama was right. She always said she felt you were alive somewhere. Catherine stood up abruptly, walking over to the glass, her red eyes fixed on the reflected image of Mason, the man she thought she knew so well, now a stranger with a story she was barely beginning to understand. "We need to discuss the next steps," Lauren said gently. "The Pierces will be considered fugitives. We've already issued a national alert, but with the advantage they have—" "I want to talk to her," Mason interrupted, looking directly into the glass. "With Isabella." Lauren hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Seconds later, Isabella entered the interrogation room. Her maid's uniform replaced by simple clothes borrowed from Margaret. The siblings stared at each other in silence, decades of separation weighing them down. "What was she like?" Mason finally asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Our mother." Isabella sat up slowly, pulling a folded photo out of her handbag. In it, a middle-aged woman smiled at the camera, her bright eyes identical to Isabella's. "She never gave up hope," Isabella began, her voice breaking. "Every year, on your birthday, she would bake a cake and sing, 'Happy Birthday' in Spanish. She said that one day you would come back for a slice." Mason touched the photograph with trembling fingers. "I have dreams sometimes, with a smell of cinnamon and vanilla. Pan dulce?" Isabella smiled through her tears. "She used to make it every Sunday morning." Catherine watched the scene through the glass, her heart broken not only by the loss of her planned future, but by the pain evident in the eyes of the man she loved, a man who was now discovering that his whole life had been built on lies. "What happens now?" Mason asked, looking between Isabella and the detective. "Now," Lauren replied softly, "we start to piece together his story. Your real story." Isabella reached across the table, hesitating. After a moment's hesitation, Mason took it, establishing the first real connection with her lost past. On the other side of the glass, Catherine finally allowed herself to cry, her silent tears marking the end of a dream and the beginning of a reality that no one had foreseen. The night that should have celebrated a beginning had turned into a moment of rupture and discovery, leaving everyone involved adrift in a sea of long-submerged truths, now rising to the surface with overwhelming force. Isabella's house, in the working-class neighborhood of Stanford, was a stark contrast to the Morrison mansion. Mason stood in the small living room, looking at the dozens of family photos that covered the walls. Smiling faces that shared his features stared back at him, telling the story of a life that should have been his. "This is Papa." Isabella pointed to a framed photograph above the fireplace. "Roberto Rodriguez. He died when you were just 3 months old." Mason approached the photo, his reflection in the glass superimposed on the image of the smiling man. The same chin, the same deep-set eyes. It was like looking into a mirror through time. "The Pierces told me I had Mediterranean features because of an Italian great-grandmother," he murmured, touching the glass of the frame. The sound of clicking pottery came from the small kitchen, where Carmen, their maternal aunt, was preparing breakfast. The aroma of freshly made tortillas filled the room, awakening memories that Mason didn't even know he had. "Mason?" Catherine's voice sounded hesitant from the front door. She had insisted on coming, despite her father's objections. Isabella moved to greet her, her years of training as a maid automatically making her act as hostess. "Come in, please. Carmen is preparing the coffee." Catherine entered timidly, looking out of place in her designer clothes. Her eyes met Mason's briefly before straying to the photographs. "You have the same eyes," she commented softly. "You and your mother." "Elena," Isabella corrected gently. "Our mother was called Elena." Mason's cell phone vibrated, another call from Richard Morrison. He ignored it, as he had done with the last 20. His father-in-law was desperate to control the situation before the press found out the full story. "Found it." Carmen emerged from the kitchen, carrying a worn shoebox. Elena kept everything. They all sat around the small dining table. Carmen opened the box with reverential care, revealing a treasure trove of memories. Alexander's first shoe, locks of hair, vaccination cards, and dozens of photos from the first months of his life. This was at his christening. Isabella picked up a yellowed photograph. Mama was so proud. You didn't stop crying during the whole ceremony. Catherine watched Mason examine each item with painful fascination. Her fiancé, she still didn't know what to call him in her mind, seemed simultaneously lost and found. "Do the police have any leads on the Pierce boys?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "They were last seen in Montreal," Mason replied mechanically. "But the trail, when called?" "Cowards," Carmen muttered in Spanish, putting a pile of tortillas on the table. "Stealing a baby, destroying a family, they loved me," Mason said suddenly, his voice breaking. "I know what they did is unforgivable, but they loved me." A heavy silence fell over the table. Isabella reached for her brother's hand, squeezing it gently. "True love isn't built on lies, Mijo," Carmen said softly. "Elena died without being able to hold her youngest son. What kind of love robs a mother of that?" Catherine stood up abruptly, silent tears streaming down her face. "I need some air." Mason tried to follow her, but Isabella stopped him. "Let her process. We all need time." On the back porch, Catherine stared out at the small, well-kept garden, where red roses, Elena's favorites, she now knew bloomed in the morning sun. Her phone vibrated with a message from her father. "We can sort this out discreetly. Stop this madness and come home." Oh, which home? The man she had planned to build a life with had just discovered that his own life was an elaborate lie. How could she trust a future built on such a foundation? Inside the house, Mason held one last photograph. Elena in a hospital bed, just weeks before she passed away, holding a baby portrait of Alexander. "She never gave up hope," Isabella explained, tears streaming down her face. "Even at the end, she said she could feel that you were alive somewhere, living a good life." "And I was," Mason whispered. "While she was suffering, I was living a privileged life in Connecticut, planning a $1 million wedding, completely unaware of how much had been stolen from me, from her, from all of us." Karma began to hum softly as she tidied up the kitchen, the same lullaby Elena used to sing. Mason closed his eyes, letting the tears flow freely as long-buried memories began to awaken. Catherine watched from the window, her heart broken not only by her lost love, but by the depth of the tragedy unfolding before her. How does one recover when one discovers that one's entire life has been built on a lie? How do you move on when the past and the present collide with such force? On the small makeshift altar in the corner of the room, a candle burned in front of Elena's photo. In her last portrait, she smiled with the same unwavering hope that kept her searching for her lost son until her last breath. Now, at last, Alexander had found his way home, even if the price of that truth was still being calculated. Morrison heiress betrothed to kidnapped baby? The scandal that rocked Greenwich. Mason was looking at the New York Times headline on his tablet, sitting in a discreet cafe on Manhattan's Lower East Side. After 3 days of press siege in Greenwich, he had fled to the city, seeking some kind of anonymity among millions of strangers. The barista placed his third cup of coffee on the table, casting him a curious glance. He had clearly recognized him from the news, but remained professionally aloof. The story had exploded in the media like a tsunami, dragging everyone involved into the eye of the hurricane. His phone vibrated with a notification, another email from Richard Morrison. The subject was straightforward: final proposal. Mason deleted it without opening it, just as he had done with the previous ones. There wasn't enough money in the world to buy his silence. Not anymore. "I thought I'd find you here," Catherine's voice surprised him. She slid into the chair in front of him, looking exhausted under her large sunglasses. "You always said this cafe had the best cold brew in town." "Cat," he began, but she held up a hand, interrupting him. "Dad's furious," she said, removing her glasses and revealing eyes red from crying. "He thinks you planned all this. That, Isabella, and you set up some kind of coup. Of course he thinks that." Mason laughed humorlessly. Richard Morrison can't imagine that his perfect, hand-picked son-in-law could actually be his maid's son. "And you?" Catherine asked softly. Who do you think you are now? The question hung between them, heavy as lead. On the cafe's television screens, a reporter was interviewing experts on the case. Mason's face, next to his baby photo as Alexander, filled half the screen. Yesterday, I went to the Pierce apartment, he finally said, or what's left of it. The police cleared the place after they finished forensics. Catherine waited in silence while he gathered his thoughts. I found a diary. Patricia's. My mother's. No, the woman who robbed me, he corrected bitterly. She wrote about everything. How she watched me in hospital for weeks. How she planned every detail. She wrote that when she picked me up, I smiled at her. She said it was a sign from God. Mason, Alexander, he corrected softly. My name is Alexander. Catherine absorbed the correction like a physical blow. So you decided? The decision was made 28 years ago, when I was taken from my family, he replied. I'm just recovering who I should have been. The cafe was fuller now, and some customers were starting to point and whisper. A waitress approached, offering to take them to a more private area at the back. Isabella met our cousins in Arizona, Ma. Alexander continued as they moved to another table. We have a whole family there. Uncles, cousins, nephews. They all thought I was dead. Now they want to meet me. Carmen is organizing a family reunion in Phoenix next month. Catherine played with the engagement ring on her finger. She hadn't managed to remove it yet. What about us? Alexander looked at the woman he loved, his heart torn between two lies, two identities, two realities that seemed impossible to reconcile. How can we move on, Kat? Every moment of our relationship was built on a lie. Mason Pierce doesn't even exist. But our love exists, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. That was real. Before he could reply, his phone vibrated again. This time it was Isabella. Alec, she said when he picked up, using the nickname he had begun to accept. They've found the Pierces. The world seemed to freeze. Where? Vancouver. Interpol intercepted them, trying to board a flight to Europe. They want to talk to you. Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that information. The Pierces, the people who raised him, who loved him, who stole from him, would finally have to face the consequences of their actions. I'm taking the first flight out, he said, hanging up. Catherine watched him, painful understanding in her eyes. You will. I need to look them in the eye, he explained. I need to understand. I need answers. And then what? Then he hesitated, looking out of the cafe window at the city. Then I need to find out who Alexander Rodriguez is. I need to know my family, my history, my truth. Without Mason Pierce, Catherine added softly. Without Mason Pierce, he confirmed, finally finding the courage to say out loud what they both already knew. Catherine slowly removed the engagement ring, placing it on the table between them. The diamond sparkled under the cafe lights, capturing fragments of a life that now seemed to belong to other people. I loved you as Mason, she said, standing up. I hope Alexander finds the peace he's looking for. She leaned down, kissing him softly on the forehead, a farewell gesture that carried the weight of all the futures they would no longer have. As he watched her go, Alexander Rodriguez, no longer Mason Pierce, realized that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. And as his phone vibrated with the details of his flight to Vancouver, he knew he was just beginning his real journey of self-discovery. The interrogation room of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Vancouver was cold and impersonal, its gray walls silent witnesses to countless confrontations with the truth. Alexander watched through the one-way glass as Patricia Pierce was led inside. The woman he had called mother for 28 years now looked smaller, more fragile, her gray hair disheveled, in her cuffed hands trembling slightly. Are you sure you want to do this now? Isabella asked softly beside him. She had insisted on traveling with him, refusing to let him face this moment alone. I have to, he replied, his voice hoarse. I need to know why. Inspector Davies, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a British accent, opened the door. She's asking to see you. Just you? Alexander adjusted his tie, then automatic gesture that Mason Pierce would have made, and entered the room. Patricia looked up, tears immediately streaming down her aged face. Mason, she whispered. Alexander, he corrected gently. taking a seat opposite her. "My name is Alexander Rodriguez." Patricia closed her eyes, as if the word physically hurt her. "You'll always be Mason to me." "Why?" The question that had been consuming him for days finally escaped. "Why me? Why our family?" Patricia interlaced her fingers on the table, her handcuffs tinkling softly. "You smiled at me. That day in the hospital. You smiled when I picked you up from the nursery. After 5 miscarriages, after years of trying, you smiled at me as if I were your mother." "I was 3 months old," Alexander replied, his voice trembling. "I smiled at everyone." "You don't understand." Patricia leaned forward. "It was a sign. God was showing me that you should be my son, that I could be a better mother than that uneducated young woman who barely spoke English." Anger exploded in Alexander's chest. "That uneducated young woman died calling for the son you stole from her. Elena Rodriguez worked 2 jobs to support me after my father died. She never gave up looking for me, never gave up hope. We gave you a better life." Patricia interrupted, her voice rising. "Education at the best schools, international travel, opportunities you would never have had. You stole my identity," Alexander retorted, tears now running freely down his face. "You stole my language, my culture, my family. Do you know how many cousins I have in Arizona? 17. I have uncles, aunts, nephews who grew up hearing stories about the cousin who was stolen in the nursery. Every Christmas, every birthday, every important moment, you didn't just steal from me, you stole from all of them too." On the other side of the glass, Isabella sobbed silently. Carmen, who had also insisted on coming, holding her hand. "Where's Richard?" Alexander asked suddenly. Where is the man who called himself my father?" Patricia looked away. "He couldn't take it. The night we ran away, he took a whole bottle of sleeping pills. I found him in the hotel in Montreal." The shock of the revelation hit Alexander like a punch. Richard Pierce, the man who taught him to ride a bike, who took him to baseball games, who cried on his first day at college, had chosen death rather than face the consequences of his actions. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice just a whisper. "When I grew up, when I became an adult. Why keep the lie going? How could we?" Patricia replied, looking genuinely perplexed. "You were our son, our only joy. Telling the truth would have meant losing you. And now you've lost me anyway." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander could hear his own heart beating, each pulse marking the definitive end of Mason Pierce. "You know what's ironic?" he continued after a moment. "Elena, my real mother, she would forgive me. Isabella told me that in the last few days, she said she only wanted to know if I was happy, if I was loved. She would have forgiven you, just to be able to hold me one last time." Patricia began to sob openly. "Mason, please." "Alexander," he corrected again, standing up. "Mason Pierce died the moment you decided that love justified the theft of a child." He walked to the door, but stopped before leaving. "The detectives want to know where the original documents are. My birth certificate, the photos. I know you kept everything." "In a bag," Patricia replied through sobs. "Safe at the First National in Greenwich. The key is in the house, hidden behind the loose tile in the first-floor bathroom." Alexander nodded, his hand on the doorknob. "Goodbye, Patricia." "I love you," she whispered. "I always have. That's never been a lie." "I know," he replied softly. "That's the worst of it. You loved me so much that you destroyed 3 lies in the process." When he left the room, Isabella and Carmen immediately wrapped him in a hug. He allowed himself to cry, not for the future he had lost, but for the past he never had a chance to live. "Let's go home," Isabella whispered in Spanish. "Our family is waiting." Alexander nodded, allowing himself to be guided out of that cold place, towards an uncertain but honest future. The weight of the truth was crushing, but for the first time since Isabella had interrupted his engagement party, he could breathe freely. Mason Pierce had died in that interrogation room. Alexander Rodriguez was finally starting to live. Phoenix International Airport was sweltering in the heat of the Arizona desert. Alexander stood in the arrivals area, looking through the glass windows at the barren landscape that should have been his home. Isabella squeezed his hand gently, while Carmen murmured a prayer in Spanish. "The está." Isabella pointed to a large group approaching, carrying colorful signs with welcoming messages in English and Spanish. "Our family." Alexander felt his heart race as he identified faces he knew only from recent photographs shared on a hastily created WhatsApp group. Uncle Miguel, his father's older brother, now a white-haired man with the same smile Alexander saw every morning in the mirror. Aunt Rosa, who had the same almond-shaped eyes as Isabella. Cousins, nephews, a whole constellation of Rodriguez's who had waited 28 years for this moment. "Welcome home, nephew." Miguel was the first to hug him, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. "You're identical to your father." The introductions blended into a whirlwind of hugs, kisses, and tears. Alexander found himself enveloped in a wave of love so intense that he could barely process it. Each face bore familiar features, like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. Vengan, Rosa commanded, organizing the group. "Lunch is waiting, and God help me if I let my nephew go another minute without tasting my tamales." The convoy of cars snaked through the suburbs of Phoenix until they reached a modest house with a flowery garden. The aroma of home-cooked food filled the air, and Alexander felt something awaken in his memory, a distant echo of comfort and belonging. "This used to be your grandparents' house," Isabella explained as they entered. "Now it belongs to Uncle Miguel. Mama grew up here." In the living room, an entire wall was dedicated to family photos. In the center, framed in gold, was the last photo of Elena Rodriguez with her baby, the same one Isabella had shown him that first night at their home in Stanford. "Ella nunca perdió la esperanza," Miguel said softly. "Your mother knew that one day you would come back to us." Lunch was served in the backyard, where tables had been set up under colorful awnings. Alexander found himself surrounded by cousins eager to share stories, curious nephews who watched him with wide eyes, aunts who insisted on piling more food on his plate. "How's the Spanish?" asked Marina, a cousin of the same age, as she served him more horchata. "Taking online classes," he admitted. It's like something is waking up inside me. Words I didn't know I knew, memories I didn't know I had. The sangre da Mateo Miguel nari decidedi. The blood calls." As the afternoon progressed, Alexander found himself absorbing every detail. The way his Aunt Rosa gestured exactly like Isabella, the laughter that echoed his own, the stories about his father that filled in gaps he didn't even know existed. "Roberto was the family artist," Miguel said, showing old drawings that he had kept with affection. "You have his hands, wide at the base of the fingers." Artist's hands. Alexander flexed his fingers, remembering how easy he had always been to draw, a talent De Pierce's never fully understood. "We found this in the basement," Rosa said, bringing out a carved wooden box. "Your father made it for you before he left. He said that one day you would use it." Inside the box, a set of brushes and painting materials, preserved for decades, waited for hands that should have touched them long ago. "He died thinking of you," Miguel continued softly. "His last days, all he talked about was how he wished he'd had more time to teach you how to paint." Alexander touched the brushes reverently, feeling the weight of an inheritance that transcended the millions that Mason Pierce should have inherited. As the sun began to set, tinting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, the family gathered to take photos. Alexander found himself at the center of 3 generations of Rodriguez's, each face reflecting fragments of his own image. "How do you feel?" Isabella asked softly, watching him gaze at the desert horizon. As if I were waking up from a very long dream," he replied. Or maybe finally dreaming the right dream." Carmen approached, carrying something wrapped in embroidered fabric. "Elena kept this for you. She wanted you to have it when you came home." With trembling hands, Alexander unwrapped the package, revealing a carved wooden rosary, the beads polished by the constant touch of prayers and hope. "She prayed for you every night with this rosary," Carmen explained. "She said that as long as you prayed, you would be protected, no matter where you were." Alexander clutched the rosary to his chest, feeling the weight of so much love. The love he never had the chance to know, the love that never stopped waiting for him, the love that finally brought him home. All around him, his family, his real family, continued to celebrate, their voices blending in a harmony of English and Spanish, of past and present, of loss and reunion. And for the first time since his life turned upside down, Alexander Rodriguez felt he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The Arizona sun finally set, but for Alexander a new day was just beginning. A year had passed since Isabella had interrupted the engagement party that would change so many lives forever. Alexander's studio in the artistic district of Phoenix was flooded with golden evening light, revealing canvases in various stages of completion. In each one, memories and dreams mixed in bursts of color and emotion. The exhibition would open in 2 hours. Echoes of Identity, his first solo show, was already generating buzz in the art world. The New York Times had published a preview the week before, highlighting how the former Manhattan executive had found his true calling through art, transforming his extraordinary story into visceral paintings that explored themes of identity, loss, and redemption. "Estás visto?" Isabella asked, entering the studio, carrying a box with the latest photographs framed for the exhibition. Alexander adjusted the collar of his shirt, no longer Mason Pierce's Italian suits, but a white guayabera that his Uncle Miguel had insisted he wear tonight. "Gussie, there's just one thing missing." He walked over to a covered canvas in the corner of the studio. It was his most important work, the one that had taken months of work and countless tears. Carefully, he removed the fabric protecting it. The portrait of Elena Rodriguez, based on her last photograph, occupied the center of the canvas. But it wasn't a simple reproduction. Alexander had painted his mother as he imagined her at different times. Young and radiant, holding a baby, singing lullabies, making pan dulce on Sundays, praying with her rosary every night. Each scene intertwined with the next, creating a tapestry of moments that never happened, but which lived on in her heart. "Yes, hermoso," Isabella whispered, tears streaming down her face. Mama would be so proud. The gallery began to come alive around them. Carmen supervised the waiters who would serve traditional Mexican food, her contribution to making the evening even more special. Tio Miguel adjusted the lights, ensuring that each work received the perfect illumination. Cousins and nephews ran back and forth, hanging up the last of the family photographs that would complement the exhibition. "Señor Rodriguez," a young gallery assistant called out to him, "there's someone here who wants to talk to you before the opening." Alexander turned and froze. Catherine Morrison was standing at the entrance to the studio, more beautiful than he remembered. "I," she said softly, taking a few hesitant steps towards him. "I hope you don't mind. I saw the article in the Times and I'm glad you came," he replied sincerely, noticing the absence of her engagement ring. "You look different," she observed, her eyes scanning the space, absorbing the explosions of color on the screens. "More you." "I'm finding myself," he smiled. "Day by day." Catherine stopped in front of Elena's portrait. "Your mother." "See," he replied, the Spanish slipping naturally into his speech now. "Older versions of her I never got to meet." "It's beautiful," she whispered. "You've always had this talent inside you, haven't you? Even when you thought you were Mason." Mason Pierce was a shadow, Alexander reflected. An incomplete version of who I was supposed to be. But I don't regret having been him. He brought me here. The sound of more guests arriving filled the room. Isabella approached discreetly. "Alec, the journalists are coming." Catherine smiled at the nickname. "Alex suits you." "Catherine," he called out when she made mention of moving away. "Thank you for being part of the journey that brought me here." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, before mingling with the other guests who were beginning to crowd the gallery. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of interviews, greetings, and explanations of his works. Alexander circulated around the space, alternating smoothly between English and Spanish, finally feeling comfortable in his own skin. Patricia Pierce had been sentenced to 12 years in prison 3 months earlier. Alexander had sent her only one message after the verdict. "I forgive you, not for what you did, but because it's what Elena would have done." There was no reply, nor did he expect one. Towards midnight, when most of the guests have left, Alexander found a moment of stillness in front of his mother's portrait. Carmen approached, placing in his hands a cup of hot chocolate, made just as Elena used to make it. "You know," she said softly, "your mother always said that some people need to lose themselves to truly find themselves." Alexander took a sip of his drink, letting the memories, both the lived ones and the dreamed ones, fill his heart. "I'm not lost anymore, Annie. I'm exactly where I should be." Isabella joined them, followed by Uncle Miguel and the rest of the family who had stayed to help organize the space. Together, they looked at Elena's portrait, her serene smile seeming to bless the moment. "Bienvenido a casa, mijo," Carmen whispered, shaking his hand. And Alexander Rodriguez, who had once been Mason Pierce, finally understood that sometimes you have to lose a life to find the one that should always have been yours. In the soft light of the gallery, surrounded by his art and his family, he was finally and truly home.